Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing.
Perfect.
Welcome, everyone. It's 11:30. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Susan Sons. I'm currently serving as Executive Director of the OmniSOC at Indiana University, which is a security operations center serving 3+ dozen institutions throughout North America, mostly things involved in scientific research, R&D, or higher education. But today I'm talking to you with a slightly different hat on. One of my bizarre hobbies is that I am a volunteer crisis communicator. On TV, they call this a hostage negotiator, but there really aren't that many hostage takings throughout the world, so we do a lot of other jobs. We talk to distraught parents who've lost a child to help the police get enough useful information that they can try to find the child. We work with people who have survived some kind of disaster or trauma. Sometimes we do suicide prevention. Sometimes we do work with folks who are in some other kind of crisis, especially just kind of the talk them down, calm things down, get things to sanity sort of jobs. And I'm going to talk about how this applies in our world of IT and cybersecurity, because it really, really does. So I talked a little bit about what this is. It is a wild ride. There are some crisis communicators who have a formal training program they go through, thanks to an old colleague of mine who's done some great work with the FBI crisis response team and building up their negotiators, but most of us don't. Crises happen everywhere. And some of us learn this in the fire. We're the one who can talk to someone. In my case, I volunteered for about a decade at a psych center that worked with at-risk and traumatized children and adolescents and their families. And then by the time I got thrust into my first hostage negotiation, which I'll talk about soon, I was more prepared and less prepared. I had no idea that anyone would characterize this as a hostage negotiation the first time around. But first we're going to talk about what is a crisis and why is this skill important. So how many of you have ever been in a situation where something has gone wrong and you're on it, you're on the technology, you know the right solution, you want to do the right thing, and some non-technical leader or stakeholder has gotten in your way because they are panicking? You knew what the right thing was to do and they wouldn't let you. Okay, now everybody keep your hand up. Now put your hand down if your stakeholders get smarter when they're panicked. Yeah, I didn't think so. That's what this is all about. This is a skill that all of us need, especially if you deal with cybersecurity and incident response, or if you're the guy who gets the phone call because all the servers fell down and we don't know why. Crises come in many forms. You just had a crash course in this, because throughout COVID, and everybody can argue about what the crisis was. Was the crisis government overreach? Was the crisis the pandemic itself? Was the crisis the complete draining of public education from our society for a couple of years? Take your pick. But at some point, you were a responder, you were a stakeholder, and you were a bystander. So think about those experiences as I talk, and think about the types of communication that can help you get the right things done. So I mentioned that the first time I did this, I didn't think of myself as a crisis communicator. I was a teenager, maybe 15 or so, and part of volunteering at the counseling center that I volunteered at was I was not a licensed psychologist. So I could do things that the licensed psychologists could not reasonably do. And one of those things was I would go around and check on some of the kids that we knew needed a little help, but hadn't become self-destructive enough that you could send a counselor to go do a welfare check. The people who just need to know that somebody cares and checks in on them. And one of these people was a girl right around my age. She was 15 or 16 herself. She was a baby. And she wisely decided to get away from the gangbanger wannabe who was the father of the child. And she moved in first with her elderly grandmother, and then tried to hang on to the apartment in a senior building after her grandmother passed because it was safer and it was sort of out of gang territory. But she didn't really have anybody who cared enough to look in on her. And I stopped by one day and I was checking on her and the baby, and I brought some things that friends or members of my family had donated for her. And the bio dad showed up. And he was really, really worked up because he was losing status in the gang he was in because his girlfriend left him. And he showed up, they argued, and he put a knife to her throat. Now, I realize I'm talking to a predominantly male audience here, but is it safe to say you all know that this is not a good way to get a girlfriend? Yes, because you're not crazy. Unfortunately, most hostage takings are not planned. Most hostage takings are the result of someone reaching a psychological breaking point and not thinking rationally. So they're running on all adrenaline, all emotions, and logic has gone out the window. Some of you may recognize this in how your stakeholders respond to a computer security incident. And I couldn't get the baby and get out, and this is not the kind of neighborhood where people call the police. But I talked to people who were losing it before, so I just started talking. And I kept talking. And I started slowing it down so the adrenaline had time to burn off. And I can't tell you how long I was talking to this guy while he, was holding a knife, but eventually he put it down and just walked away, which is kind of the best scenario you can have. And that was my first. I've done 8, 0 body bags required. I consider that a great accomplishment. And it was completely by accident. But doing this a few times, and eventually after about the 3rd one, I realized I'd become a hostage negotiator when nobody was looking. I started to develop patterns of how things worked. And what I hadn't realized during that first hostage scenario was that it was a blessing that no one knew what was going on. When it was happening, I was like, oh my God, why do I have no help? There's just nothing, it's just me. But I soon realized that when other people are there, now everyone has an opinion and an agenda and a fear that they want to have serviced, and stakeholders were coming out of the woodwork. In a typical hostage negotiation, you're not just dealing with a hostage taker, which is tricky enough in its own right. You're also dealing with the press. You're also dealing with local and possibly non-local law enforcement who have all been trained to get compliance with the law as quickly as possible and not be nice to bad guys, which is a real recipe for setting off a hostage taker. You're also dealing with people like elected officials, family members of the hostages, and possibly family members of the hostage takers. And they all have opinions, they all want to be involved, and they are all almost as emotional as the hostage taker and not being particularly helpful. You get helpful ones, but they are the exception, not the rule. They will not be a big enough majority to drive the crowd's behavior. And so what the heck do you do with them? And that's where this talk is going. Because you need to maintain the support of stakeholders. If you have the press filming all the family members of the hostages saying, oh my God, why are they negotiating? The police have to go in. All these children are going to die, and weeping in front of the camera because they're afraid, chances are that the government's going to pull out the negotiation, send in the SWAT team, and somebody's going to die. You don't want that to happen. So you need all of these people who have a stake in the outcome, that's literally what stakeholders mean. I have skin in the game, I have a stake in this. You have to maintain their support. And there's times you have to do this work. If you want to fix an IT problem, if you want to deal responsibly with an incident response in cybersecurity, the bosses have to be behind you doing so. So how do you get people's support? A big part of that is everyone at the table has to understand who has a seat at the table and who doesn't, and why that happens. They have to know the rules of the game so that they trust that they won't get cut out, and so that they can trust that the other people at the table aren't going to cause the outcome they're afraid of. And they need confidence that things are moving in the right direction. They have to understand what's going on. They have to reasonably predict what will happen. And I know that in an emergency, in a crisis of any kind, being able to predict the future is hard, so I'm going to talk about how you create that even in uncertain situations. They have to believe that whatever their individual goals are, they're going to meet that by collaborating rather than by undercutting you or undercutting one another. And they have to believe that they can manage their own stakeholders. The mayor is worried about the voting public. The chief of police is worried about keeping his job and what the town council's going to think and how he's going to look in the press. The family members, they really care if their own family member gets out. Depending on their personality, they may or may not care about anybody else. But they all have stakeholders and things they care about, and they have to believe that they're going to be better off if they cooperate. So I'm going to share a long list of tactics with you today, but there's only one strategy. Move consistently and clearly in the direction of your priorities. And I am going to repeat this so many times you will not be able to get it out of your head. At least that's my goal. Because carrying this with you is extremely powerful when you're dealing with stakeholders who are under extreme stress. So let's break this down into some parts. When I say move, what does that mean? Always maintain progress. It doesn't matter how slow. When people believe nothing is happening, that's when they freak out. And that's especially tough in hostage negotiation, because the thing that you learn is the longer the negotiation takes, the less likely it is anybody dies. But folks get impatient because they see nothing happening, and from their perspective, they think the risk is growing. But if you're ever a hostage, just stall, because hostage takings usually are not planned. It's usually someone who's adrenalized, they're having some kind of psychological break, they've hit a point of stress they can't cope with. But all of those stress hormones and adrenaline and fight or flight stuff that's coursing through their body will eventually burn out. And if you wait out that burnout, things get a lot calmer. And you have a lot of power over the situation. But that leaves you with the challenge of creating forward motion. Consistently. Crises are unpredictable. If you are the person managing the crisis, you have to be the stable and predictable factor. People need to know what to expect of you. If they see you as a wild card, that will increase their fear and increase the chances that they do something crazy. Clearly, panic fills a vacuum. If people don't know what's going on, they will fill it in their heads with all of their fears. If you know anyone who had a long-distance relationship that suddenly went sour for reasons that make no sense, it was probably because of this. They didn't know enough about each other's lives, and didn't know enough about how one another felt about things, and their heads just filled with everything they were afraid of, and they put more and more stress on the relationship until it broke. It's a really common failure pattern. It's not the only one, but for those of you who haven't been in a hostage situation, it's a really good example most of us have observed. And that's why we communicate more than we think is possibly necessary, even if it's repetitive, even if it seems redundant, or people should intuit this or observe this, communicate more anyway. People's skills of observation and capturing information go down when they're under high levels of stress. Last thing is priorities. Don't just do something, do the right thing. You have to maintain focus on what's important. It's way too easy to try to make sure nothing goes wrong. You've all met that person. They're absolutely sure that they have to make sure nothing goes wrong. And in doing so, they let big things go wrong. Because what they've done is they've taken energy and focus away from the big, really important things to put on the small, unimportant things because they want nothing to go wrong. And that's really an addictive behavior. If you ever catch yourself in it, do to disrupt it and refocus as soon as you can, because the satisfaction of getting a small unimportant thing completely fixed and getting a dopamine hit can keep you in all the small, easy to fix unimportant things and make you neglect what really matters. So I'm going to go through the reverse order because priorities really are the most important part. So move consistently and clearly in the direction of your priorities, but what the heck are you doing? So rule 1 of a hostage crisis, at least if I'm the one leading it, is this: no body bags, I get a steak. And that sounds stupid, that sounds trivial, that I'm sitting here and I'm talking to a guy who's waving his gun around in front of a bunch of innocent kids and I'm talking about what I'm having for dinner. But let's think about those other stakeholders in a room. You know, we should care about preserving life more than anything else, but it's easy to get distracted. Police, as I said, are trained and drilled and conditioned to get compliance as fast as possible. That's the opposite of what you need in a hostage crisis. Like I said, the longer it drags out, the less likely it is that somebody's going to die. So if we have to sit here and talk for 3 days, we're going to sit here and talk for 3 days. If we have to, sometimes it's 12 hours. The shortest one I ever did was like 4.5 hours. I don't know how long that first one was, though, because like I was a teenager and it seemed like eons, and I just wasn't as prepared for that one as I was for later incidents. But this is a heck of a focus. I talk about body bags a lot at hostage negotiations because I want people to understand what they're trading when they start to hyper-focus on other things, like speed of resolution, like not saying anything nice to the bad guy because he's a bad guy. Stuff that, to me, pales in comparison with all the children come out alive. So, quick poll. How many of you, in whatever job you do, or if you're not working in whatever you consider your most important role in life, if that's your family, if that's a volunteer opportunity, if that's your job, if that's your side gig, how many of you have a literally written down list of priorities from most to least important, so you know that if the least important and the most important thing are at stake, you just stop caring about the least important thing and go for the most important one? How many of you have a written down list? Yeah, it's not a lot of people. And thank you all for being candid about that. This is something that a lot of us don't take the time to do because we think we implicitly know what's important. The problem is when you are with a group of people and they are all stressed out and they all have even very slightly different ideas of what's important, the amount of conflict that can happen that steals time and focus and sanity away from your response can be huge. So you have to know priorities. This is an example from the information security programs I used to run. And our number one priority was the confidentiality of undisclosed software vulnerabilities. That's because this project did a whole lot of software analysis for everything from corporate software, stuff that was specific to higher ed, to open source software. And we maintained a treasure trove of undisclosed software vulnerabilities that could easily be a 0-day. So if nothing else succeeded, we were not going to let that treasure trove go, and we never did. The integrity of research data was next. The reason we were maintaining this was because we were doing research on how to better secure software development pipelines, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't learning things that were wrong, and our data wasn't being manipulated. The next was confidentiality of PII. Nobody likes a data breach. Reputation and public trust in the project, for obvious reasons. If we wanted to keep that funding coming in, people needed to trust that we were going to do the right thing. And the lowest priority was availability of systems and data, because when things go down, people's work doesn't get done. Your priorities may be very different from this. This was a very specific academic project with very specific core data. But my point is, write them down. Work before the crisis hits. Get everyone to agree on them before the panic hits. So here's one from Search and Rescue Triage. We start with everyone we can save if waiting would endanger their survival. Then we get to everyone who needs treatment to prevent an infection or prevent their injury from getting worse. And the very bottom, the last ones, are people who need treatment to be more comfortable or to make it easier to transport them safely. The reason that we do this is if I was in the corner dressing somebody's boo-boo while somebody else is dying from massive blood loss, that would be bad, right? Okay. So medics have been doing triage since probably the dawn of time. There have been different ideas of how we do it, but the idea that these choices need to be made is fundamentally obvious when you're in a space full of bleeding people. There is so much writing on how to do this sort of emergency medical triage. I could point you back to things that predate the founding of the Roman Empire. They come from early classical Greece. So here's what those lists have in common and all the other lists that you may make or encounter. You can't have more priorities than you can remember. If you have to look at the list in order to recite the list is either too long or the items on the list are too complicated. No two priorities can have the same importance. The whole point of a priority list is that in order to protect something near the top of the list, something below it can be sacrificed. If two things are at the same level, that is an unresolvable conflict. It will cost you time, energy, and resources in the middle of a crisis. And the last thing is priorities are clearly and consistently communicated. When I'm running an information security program, we actually put our list of priorities in the master information security policy document, and we make our management approve it or tell us what they want to change. They have looked at this, and it has been approved at the highest levels before there is an incident. And a lot of geeks hate policy. But let me tell you, having a really well-written and accepted policy in your organization is like having a bureaucrat's true name. They show up, they want to do something stupid, and you're like, nope, it's in the policy, and they just go away. Hackers don't always realize the importance of good policy because it doesn't work on us. It's like, yeah, you have a nice piece of paper, but it's stupid. That's how a lot of us think, but it's really important to get policy right in an organization because your organization isn't mostly made up of hackers, it's mostly made up of people who really care about the policy. Also, policies are a communication tool. Whether you do it in the form of policy or in another way, everybody who might be involved should know what the priority list is and agree on it before there is a crisis. Everyone should understand what it means and the trade-offs that we're going to make. When I was a very junior cybersecurity person, kind of mid-career because I started off as a programmer, we had an incident where a Department of Homeland Security sponsored research project had an attack. And my boss and his boss and basically everyone else who was on a decision maker was on a plane to an international conference. And nobody around me wanted to make a decision. But I knew, that's the one where we had this priority list. And I said, okay, we're taking all the systems offline until this is taken care of. And folks said, well, who's going to authorize that? And I said, the priority list just authorized it. And we took the systems down, and they were unavailable for a few hours. It was about a half a day. It was annoying. But we managed to protect our confidential data, we managed to protect our reputation, and we managed to verify that none of our research data had been tampered with, and those were really important things to us. And I know they're really important things because we had a priority list. So if you can follow these 3 rules, your priority list can help you in the same way. Anyone can make a smart decision because they understand the standard for smart decisions. So what about clarity? I'm going to hit on this again. You're going to get sick of seeing this on my screen, but I'm hoping that helps you remember it. Communicate. Communicate some more. There's almost no such thing as too much communication. And it's okay to not have answers if you can communicate a process. Hostage negotiation is really unpredictable, and it taught me to be comfortable dealing with unpredictable things. And I can still communicate a process. And I can tell somebody, we never know exactly how a particular situation is going to play out, but here's a framework you can use. It's going to take time to build rapport and build a trust with the hostage taker. And we need that because if they think everyone's out to get them, the adrenaline cycle and the paranoia just keeps spinning, and they can't make a decision to give up. And that's what we want. We want them to decide this is not the thing I want to be doing. And it's usually a drawn-out process to create that rapport. And it's really important that we are completely consistent from the time that process starts until the time this whole thing ends. There's a really good book called Stalling for Time by a guy named Gary Nosner. And he was one of the key people involved in spinning up the FBI crisis negotiation program. And in his book, he details several incidents where the negotiators were making progress. They thought they could talk this thing down with no violence. And then the tactical team decided to move some APCs in behind the house, and everybody panicked because now they can't trust you. Trust is really important, and you can lay that out and set an expectation. And I tell them, okay, once we've got this rapport and we've gotten trust, we get them to make some small concessions. We get to improve something. That might be, just give us this person who's hurt so that, they can get medical attention. Or, you know what, just give us the kids. You'll still be in control. You'll still have adult hostages, but there won't be any children in the room. And the reason that we do that is because they are now starting to learn that cooperating with us doesn't end their world and doesn't make them feel victimized and out of control. And I tell them, and this process can take a long time. Again, we're building trust with someone who's at a point of breaking from psychological stress. And I said, and then step 3 is we help them envision a world in which they did not kill the hostages and the world moved on. And once we get to that point, if we can make it through all of those steps, usually this thing ends peacefully. And it's hard to communicate to people if they don't have that mental framework, because they're not expecting it to look like that. And let me tell you, that's not what it looks like on TV. There's one TV show that gets it like 80% right, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's some Canadian cop show that was on a long while ago. So tell people what to expect from your process or your strategy, even if you can't tell them what thing is happening next. And tell it with one voice. This is really important in organizational settings, because if I'm telling people one thing and my boss or my partner is telling them something else, they're going to see both of us as untrustworthy because we can't get our story straight. They're going to be confused and they're going to be afraid. If you have non-technical stakeholders, if you're reporting to non-technical executives or a board of directors or an advisory board or something, and you have an incident, pick one person and they get to determine all the communication. If somebody calls me from the press in the middle of something, I send them to the university press office because they need to get this from one voice. And that way the communication is consistent and it doesn't create fear. It creates the opposite. It creates confidence. So on that subject of consistency, stakeholders are confident when they can predict what will happen next. I know this sounds counterintuitive because we're talking about inherently unpredictable situations, but it really does work. If they know what they can predict from you, and if one of the things they've predicted is, well, sometimes this thing's going to go a little crazy, but Susan's on top of it. It works. It creates confidence. They feel like, oh, I knew this was going to happen. I was prepared for this. So if I know that I can see things coming at me that were predicted and that are familiar, I have confidence that I understand the situation. And when people don't have that confidence, you start to hear things like, well, anything could happen. And they start freaking out about an extremely unlikely result that would be bad. They're thinking about black swans that happen less than 1 in a million times. But they're freaking out because they know that they don't understand the situation and they can't predict what will happen, so everything has an infinite likelihood of happening. And that's a terrifying place to be, and you can prevent them from getting there by creating predictability. So, where does this confidence come from? Clear communication. They need to understand what's going on. That feeling of not understanding ruins people's ability to assess risk. They want to believe they can reasonably predict what might happen. This is often in an incident with information security. I start with, here's the range of possibilities of what could go wrong, and I'm going to work on narrowing that while we are responding and fixing things. And the next time I talk to them, I describe the set of possibilities, and it just got a little smaller. And then it got a little smaller. And that progression creates confidence. Again, they need to know their goals will be met by collaborating rather than undercutting, and that they can manage their own stakeholders. Giving people this confidence gets them through an incident without them becoming a little bit crazy. And part of that is to continue moving. This is where we started, with movement. Forward motion in a crisis. How do you create it? Because sometimes crises take a really long time to resolve, and people have a lot of time to get themselves worked up, to spin in their heads, to have all these possibilities overwhelm them. Discovery. Find and communicate new facts and evidence. There are a lot of tech people who are perfectionists. You know who you are. And they don't want to bring something to stakeholders until they have a definitive answer. But if you do that, you are leaving your stakeholders with long spans of time where they believe nothing useful is happening. What you should be doing is saying, okay, hey, stakeholders, we still have an open question about our website and the site that we use to train interns, which is in the DMZ, and our test data on our staging server before software goes to production. But we've ensured that nobody has broken into the database with our scary software vulnerabilities. So we've got that now. That is huge progress from a stakeholder perspective, because you just took a whole range of their fears and wiped them off the table. They're not even possible anymore. So reporting discovery incrementally along the way helps create that feeling of forward motion that things have been accomplished. Agreement is another one. Now, do not fall into this as a black hole. Anything can be done in a dysfunctional way if you try hard enough. When there are specific commitments and actions and they are written down and everyone has agreed to them and everyone is going to be held accountable if they don't happen, that's a meaningful agreement. Don't get locked into 13 people in a committee to make a decision. That's usually not a great way to make decisions. Usually we try to agree on operating principles. But if you finally caused an agreement, that's fewer people who can cause trouble from your stakeholders' perspective. So bring that to them, let them realize that forward progress is happening. Actions, don't confuse activity for results. Oh yeah, I've talked to the hostage taker 3 times and they're like, okay, is anybody fewer getting guns pointed at them? But if you don't confuse activity for results, your small steps that you take will add up over time, and helping people understand what those steps are helps them have confidence that progress is really being made. And the final one is impacts, and this is the big thing. Report the things that you're achieving as you're achieving them, and report things that go wrong. Make people confident that you're not hiding anything. But as I described before, if you're completely narrowing the bounds of what is possible and what can go wrong, that is the biggest kind of progress that you can make in a crisis. Never promise something that you're only mostly sure will happen. You have to be sure, because that confidence comes from everything coming out of your mouth being true. But as soon as you're sure about something, report it. Look for small, concrete results on the way to big results. Do not be the perfectionist. We're not looking for perfect in a crisis. We're looking for better than it was before. Because if we keep incrementally making the situation better, eventually it'll be good. Address your priorities in order of priority. Be willing to cut everything else. And one-voice communication doesn't just protect your message, it protects the work. There are a lot of folks who are going to want to interrupt the people actually dealing with the crisis. They want information. They want to be soothed. They want to know that this thing they're afraid of isn't going to happen. They want to feel a sense of control. If you let them do that, none of those people are going to be able to do their best work, and they're going to be doing a lot less work because they're constantly being harassed and interrupted and questioned, and it's a lot to deal with when you're also solving a crisis. So having that one voice, they're also the one point where people can get information and get satisfaction, and you train everybody else to say, nope, you need to talk to this person. They're the only one who can give out information. And that protects their ability to do the work. So I hope I've convinced you that this isn't just something that works, but it's something that you can do. Somewhere in your life or your work, when you come into a crisis, and there are people who have opinions, there are people who have needs, there are people who have skin in the game, and you need to keep them on board and you need to keep things moving forward. Move consistently and clearly in the direction of your priorities. And yes, I repeat that to myself a lot when a crisis is going on. So think about what's next. What could be happening with you and your stakeholders? Can you make and agree on a priority list that will help you if a crisis ever does happen? How can you prepare your team? If you work with a team, understanding each other's behaviors in a crisis ahead of time makes you that much more effective. One of the things when I was on search and rescue, we didn't just practice the things that we practiced, we also practiced what everybody should do if somebody went off script. Because at times, it's search and rescue. Sometimes you have to go off script. Sometimes things happen you don't realize. Sometimes you're working a forest fire, and you find somebody's meth lab in the forest, and you're like, wow, we now have an area that is going to explode. We need to change what we're doing, and we need to change it drastically now. So knowing your team that well, running cybersecurity tabletops, drilling different types of IT failures, drilling things that can go wrong from a world or organizational perspective. You know, what do we do if there's a wildfire coming down on our data center? What do we do if the office has been hit by a tornado? These things happen. You can play it out, and that makes you that much more prepared. So thanks for listening. I made sure to leave us plenty of time at the end of this talk so that you can ask questions or run scenarios by me, because I really like thinking about this crisis stuff. And I hope you guys do too, and I hope you've learned something, or at least I've made you start thinking about a question you weren't thinking about before. I love it. Talk about lack of clear communication. Nobody knew if they were supposed to ask a question or clap, and I saw 2 people try to do both at once. Let's start up here, and then we'll go over there.
So I've got a question. How do you deal with bystanders who aren't actual stakeholders, but they try to get involved as stakeholders?
So bystanders happen for one of 2 reasons, and they're very different. So I'm going to divide them into 2 groups. There are bystanders who do have skin in the game, but they don't have enough control to get themselves at the table with like a stakeholder. So they really do, they are stakeholders, they're sort of hidden powerless stakeholders. And that's a big deal because now there's this situation that's going to affect their lives. Maybe their kid's one of the hostages, you know? And they don't know how to get any control over the situation, and they're just desperately trying to be part of it. And if you can yourself or designate someone else to work with them so that they keep getting information, that's usually enough to set them at ease. Because what they're fearing is that they will not have done enough and something horrible will happen. Because they're not in a position where they can get any control. And usually they're afraid enough you don't want them to have control because they're acting on emotion. But on my search and rescue team, one of the things we did is if we had a situation like that, I had a guy who was really good with people. He was also coincidentally the one who held my baby when I did crazy things. And I think having a baby in his arms like calmed other people down. And I would tell him, okay, Marco's gonna come talk to you and he is going to update you every 30 minutes. And all of the families are sitting vigil together here so that you guys can lean on each other, you can talk to each other. And that gets them in a manageable place, because what they wanted was to not feel like they weren't doing enough, because this really does affect their lives and they don't want to have regrets later. And you know, I tell them, Marco will ask you if we need information to help us with this. He'll let you know if there's anything you can do, but the biggest thing you can do right now is support each other. So those bystanders are really like hidden stakeholders. And then you have the other kind of bystanders. Nothing interesting has happened in their life lately, and damn it, this is interesting, and they want to be in the middle of it. Sometimes that's because they have a particular self-image they're trying to feed. Sometimes it's because they're bored. Sometimes it's because they want to be in the know when somebody asks them about it, because they'll get a lot of attention. And sometimes it's about getting attention in the moment. So a couple of things. First of all, we always make sure they aren't in that hidden stakeholder group that I described first. And then second, we set a barrier. You can come this far and you can watch if you want to, but you do not cross this line. Doing search and rescue with a bunch of Army guys, including special operations, made this really easy because nobody wanted to piss them off. And we said this is the one place you can get information from. And sometimes that's not even our information giver, because if there's a lot going on, we tell them, the press is actively reporting on this. turn on your radio. Go sit in your car and listen to your radio. Or watch it on TV from home, because they're going to be reporting on this. You'll have a chance to learn what's going on. And maybe you work for a company and something happened in their building, and I'm sure your boss will make an announcement when everybody comes back to work. We kind of set barriers, keep them at a distance, but don't make them feel like they're being completely shut out. And that helps a lot. Okay, who's next? I think you were.
From like a cyber IT incident management perspective, are there any tools just a notebook or a piece of software or a solution that you find is useful for tracking what's happening throughout an incident?
So we do a couple of things. First of all, in our SOC, we do use something called case management software that tracks investigations very particularly. But there's a lot that goes on outside the technical investigation. I've got my guys going through Elastic. Oh, we're going to make a new Kibana dashboard because this happened. Oh, somebody needs to go log into the server and find out if the binary matches this hash. All of that technical work is easily captured in a case management system. There's a few out there. There was one that I'm forgetting. The name had something to do with bees, and I was sad because it's really good, and then they jacked up the price till nobody can afford to use it. There's some case management built into Elastic that we've been working with them on improving lately. And there are some independent things that are just case managers, and they're not built into another tool. The other thing we do is we have to track a lot of communications. We have to track a lot of things that are working with stakeholders. We have to track who made a decision in what discussion. And if we have to, and it's primitive and we have a team that doesn't usually work together, what we do is we come up with a Google Doc or the private equivalent working off of one of our NASAs, and just everybody adds to it as we go. And we've got a revision history, and we've got time codes of when things were added or changed, and that helps us a lot. When I'm working with my incident response team that I built up, we have 3 people who don't have a heck of a lot to do in a normal incident. Because let me tell you, my marketing guy is not marketing in the middle of an incident. My project manager isn't managing a project, and my administrative assistant isn't off booking me travel or something. So they actually are designated historians. And every meeting will have one of them in it taking accurate notes so that everybody else can operate as fast as they can operate. And then they will bring those together and coordinate so that if somebody needs a piece of information, they can always get it from that trio. And it's been a really powerful tool for us, first of all, because why would you take 3 talented people and just leave them on the sidelines and say, yeah, we're having a crisis, but don't do anything? That's a waste of talent. And second of all, it helps my tech people get a lot of their brain back, because now the part of their brain they were spending on documenting is now freed up to do other work, which is really, really helpful. And you don't need a ton of technical skills to be a historian. You have to have a watch that works so you can say what time something happened, and you have to be good at taking notes, and you have to listen. That's about it. So we use this historian thing to help us with all the stuff that isn't necessarily technical and doesn't immediately make it into the case management system. And then we can smush all the documentation at the end when things are calm.
So I guess going off of that, the most important roles, you just have to have someone. The least important, if you have somebody, it's good to, it's nice to have. Do you have a list?
Are you speaking specifically of cybersecurity incident response here? Incident response in general. Okay, so that's a really big field. So when I say in general, I'm covering everything from search and rescue, trying to find out what happened, to the Boy Scout jamboree that they lost half of in a forest fire, to incident response on a program with a lot of critical data, and everything else in between. A few things. One, there needs to be an incident commander. Somebody needs to be in charge and have final word, because a lot of times if a decision is delayed or made too quickly, it will cause more harm than making the wrong decision. Timing matters a lot in a crisis, and that timing can only happen when we know exactly who's making the decision and we're not waiting for a committee. It also means that decisions will be made promptly, clearly, well, hopefully clearly if your incident commander is any good at anything, and that they will be consistent, because we can't have miscommunication between different people running the show, and the only way to be absolutely sure that can't happen is to let it only be one person. I'm really good at not contradicting myself, But even if you take the people that I know the best and work the best with in this whole world, like the people from my first search and rescue, my husband, my kid, at some point there's a risk of us getting out of sync. So incident commander is the first one. The second thing that you actually have to have is what we call boots on the ground, people who can do the legwork of dealing with the crisis. And that in some types of crises, that's all one person. In some crises, that's a really big team. But the feature that those boots on the ground have to have is they have to have an understanding of what they're doing, hopefully actual practice, because practice and training and conditioning take you a lot further than theoretical learning. They have to communicate to one another well, and they have to be committed to acting as a team. And the third thing you need, and again, if this is a small thing, these roles might overlap. The third thing you need is someone who is an outward communicator. Someone who can say, this is what's happening on the team. And in a really good team, a really experienced team, these roles are going to float around to different people based on what's expedient at the moment. When I worked with my first SAR, if there was a medical emergency, I was immediately in charge because I was the medic. So obviously, right? If there was an emergency where we were trying to extract people and it's a difficult climb, our 2 climbing experts, one of them would be deemed in charge. If we had a really big, complex incident where we needed to keep everybody in the field and we had to make a lot of strategic decisions quickly, our team lead, AJ, was usually that person. And when local law enforcement was freaking out because all these big, scary military types are stealing our thunder, then I was in charge because, frankly, I was a pudgy civilian woman who was doing search and rescue with my baby in a backpack on my back. And if you try to get in a, measuring contest with that, you just lose. It's like, nah, I'm a squishy mom. Like, there's no man card here. And it's very disarming. So passing those positions around is a sign of an experienced team because they know what will be most effective in the moment. Any other questions? Okay.
You mentioned some other books that folks have written and coursework and that kind of stuff. Do you have a list, like a reading, suggested reading list?
I can put one up while I'm still at the conference. I have a little personal portfolio site at security.engineering, and I'll get a page up for this talk probably tonight or in the morning, depending on how exhausted I am. I have not. Well, I haven't written a book on this. I've written tech books. I've never done a book on this.
I can see a lot of parallels to other activities.
There really is. Yeah. Coming into information security, I knew that I liked security because I was working as a software architect who specialized in turning around disasters. And sometimes those disasters were cybersecurity related, and I got to really love it. And when I moved into cybersecurity, I thought incident response was going to be this whole new thing, but no, actually, the search and rescue prepares you for that shockingly well. So, other questions? Everybody's really quiet. Yeah, I know. Either you're really hungry or I've bored you or I've already answered all your questions. I'm not sure which. But okay, I'll be around for a little bit if anybody wants to chat after this. You have my work email. I have a personal email if anybody wants it. But thank you for coming and thank you for listening.